The year is 1945. The world is exhaling. The most destructive war in human history is over. Cities that were once centers of culture lie in ruins. Nations that were once great powers are shadows of their former selves. From the ashes of this global conflict, the titans emerge. Standing wounded but victorious, the United States of America and the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, they were allies, bound by a common enemy. But their alliance was a marriage of convenience, not conviction. One was the beacon of democratic capitalism, a nation built on individual liberty. The other was the heart of a communist revolution, a state built on collective ideology and iron-fisted control. Their worldviews were fundamentally incompatible as the world celebrated peace. A new kind of war was quietly beginning, a war of whispers and shadows, a war of ideas and influence, a war of absolute fear. This was the Cold War. The cracks in the Grand Alliance appeared even before the final shots were fired. In February 1945, at a resort in Yalta, the leaders of the Big Three, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin met to carve up the post-war world. On the surface, agreements were made. Germany would be divided into 4 occupation zones. The United Nations would be formed to ensure future peace. But beneath the handshakes, distrust was festering. Roosevelt, frail and nearing the end of his life, sought a stable, democratic Europe. Churchill, deeply suspicious of Stalin's ambitions, feared a Soviet shadow falling across the continent, and Stalin, whose country had suffered more than 27 million dead, was obsessed with one thing: security. He was determined to create a buffer zone of friendly, communist-controlled states in Eastern Europe to protect the Soviet Union from any future invasion. This was non-negotiable. 5 months later, at Potsdam, the atmosphere had chilled considerably. Roosevelt was dead, replaced by the more confrontational Harry S. Truman. During the conference, Truman received a secret message. America had successfully tested the atomic bomb. This new, terrifying power shifted the global balance in an instant. The Soviets, while not openly admitting it, were already well on their way to developing their own. Thanks to a network of spies, the atomic age had begun, and with it, the age of nuclear diplomacy. Stalin, true to his goal, began installing loyal communist governments throughout Eastern Europe, breaking the promises of free elections he had made at Yalta. The Soviet army, which had liberated these countries from the Nazis, did not go home. The West watched in alarm. On March 5, 1946, in the small town of Fulton, Missouri, Winston Churchill gave a voice to their fears. In a speech that would echo through history, he declared a new reality. The Iron Curtain was no longer a metaphor. It was a harsh political and ideological reality. On one side lay the free, democratic West. On the other, the communist, Soviet-dominated East. There would be no easy commerce, no free travel, no simple exchange of ideas. The continent was divided. The first major test of this new reality came. In 1947, Greece was embroiled in a civil war, with communist-backed insurgents threatening to topple the monarchy in neighboring Turkey. The Soviets were pressuring for access to strategic waterways. Great Britain, exhausted and bankrupt from the war, could no longer afford to support them. The responsibility fell to the United States. President Truman went before Congress and laid out a new foreign policy that would define America for decades. I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. This was the Truman Doctrine. It was a radical departure from America's traditional policy of isolationism. It was a global pledge of containment, a promise to contain the spread of communism. Wherever it threatened to expand, the United States was now the world's policeman. But containment wasn't just a military strategy. It was also an economic one. American leaders believed that communism thrived in poverty and chaos. A prosperous Europe would be the best defense against its allure. In June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall proposed a breathtakingly ambitious plan, the European Recovery Program, better known as the Marshall Plan. The United States would offer billions of dollars in aid to rebuild the economies of Europe. The plan was offered to all European nations, including the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc satellites. Stalin saw it for what it was, a brilliant strategic move to bind Western Europe to the United States. He rejected it outright and forbade any Eastern European country from participating. The Marshall Plan became a staggering success in the West, rebuilding economies and solidifying the alliance against the Soviets. It also deepened the economic divide between the two halves of Europe. Nowhere was this division more stark than in the city of Berlin, located deep inside the Soviet occupation zone of East Germany. The city itself was also divided, with its western sectors controlled by the Americans, British, and French. West Berlin was an island of democratic capitalism and a sea of communism, a thorn in Stalin's side. In June of 1948, he decided to remove it. Soviet forces blockaded all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, cutting off more than 2 million people from food, fuel, and supplies. Stalin's gambit was clear: starve the city into submission, and force the Western allies to abandon it. The West was faced with a terrible choice: give up Berlin and suffer a humiliating defeat, or try to break the blockade militarily and risk World War III. President Truman chose a third option, one of defiance and ingenuity: an airlift. It seemed impossible. How could a city of millions be supplied entirely from the air? For nearly a year, the Berlin Airlift was a constant roar in the skies. American and British planes flew hundreds of thousands of flights, delivering everything from coal and flour to medicine and chocolate. At the height of the operation, a plane was landing in West Berlin every 45 seconds. The airlift became a powerful symbol of Western resolve. The sight of American pilots dropping candy for German children turned former enemies into steadfast allies. In May of 1949, realizing his plan had failed and was a public relations disaster, Stalin lifted the blockade. The first major confrontation of the Cold War was over. The West had won. The Berlin crisis solidified the division of Europe. The Western powers united to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, a formal military alliance. Its founding principle, Article 5, stated that an attack on one member was an attack on all. The message to Moscow was unmistakable. In response, the Soviet Union would later create its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The lines were drawn. The year 1949 delivered 2 more seismic shocks to the West. In China, after a long and brutal civil war, the communist forces of Mao Zedong defeated the American-backed nationalists. The world's most populous nation was now communist. Then, in August, the unthinkable happened. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb, years ahead of American predictions. The U.S. nuclear monopoly was over. Fear gripped America. The world now had 2 nuclear powers, each with the ability to incinerate the other. It was against this backdrop of rising fear that the Cold War finally turned hot. On June 25, 1950, backed by Stalin and Mao, the Communist Army of North Korea stormed across the 38th parallel, invading the pro-Western South Korea. President Truman, seeing this as a direct test of the containment policy, acted swiftly. Under the banner of the United Nations, the United States led a coalition to defend South Korea. The Korean War was a brutal, seesawing conflict. An initial rout of South Korean and American forces was reversed by a brilliant amphibious landing at Incheon, led by the audacious General Douglas MacArthur. UN forces pushed the North Koreans back, almost to the Chinese border. But this success triggered another escalation. Fearing an American presence on its doorstep, China entered the war. sending hundreds of thousands of volunteer soldiers pouring across the Yalu River. The war bogged down into a vicious stalemate around the original border, the 38th parallel. It would drag on for 3 grueling years, costing millions of lives, including over 36,000 Americans. The war ended in 1953 not with a victory, but with an armistice, a truce. To this day, North and South Korea remain officially at war, a frozen legacy of the Cold War's first major armed conflict. By 1953, the world had fundamentally changed. The hopes of 1945 were gone, replaced by a permanent state of tension and suspicion. The battle lines were drawn not just on maps, but in the minds of millions. The Iron Curtain was real, the arms race had begun, and the world had learned that the struggle between the superpowers could erupt into savage, bloody warfare. But this was only the beginning. A new kind of fear would soon grip the world, of fear of enemies unseen, of spies in the homeland, and of the horrifying power of the atom itself. A fear that would push humanity ever closer to the brink of oblivion. Join us next time on Quiet World Historians as we enter the age of anxiety. We will explore the rise of McCarthyism and the Red Scare in America, the secret battles fought by the CIA and the KGB, and the terrifying race to build a weapon 1,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb, the hydrogen bomb.